to complete the job of centralizing power on a global level, dictating to every man, woman, and child on planet Earth. That is what it's all about. And so this Dempsey chap at the Pentagon said in this announcement revealing this list that Russia has repeatedly demonstrated that it does not respect the sovereignty of its neighbors and is willing to use force to achieve its goals. This man, like everyone involved in this in the United States and Britain, has no shame whatsoever. How they can talk about this stuff and say those words without choking is one of the great wonders of the world to me. When you consider that Britain and the United States and others like France have been bombing and destroying and taking over countries by force decade after decade after decade. Russia's military actions, he said, are undermining regional security directly through proxy forces. Proxy forces? He's got to be choking now, surely. United States and Britain uses proxy forces all over the place. It's using them now in Syria under code names like moderate rebels and ISIS, of course, which they're fundamentally behind. And it says here in this article that the 2011 report by the Pentagon spoke little of Russia. No, because this global takeover by this hidden hand has a sequence that it's following, has steps it's following. In 2011, the step to start demonizing Russia to prepare for a third world conflict wasn't at that point. Now it is. And so you're seeing this demonization, including a BBC film program based on the fact that Russia had basically invaded Latvia, and the NATO countries had to react to protect its sovereignty, and it ended in a nuclear exchange, all preparing the public mind for, yeah, be afraid of Russia. And NATO, of course, which is a world army under anything but directly being named as such, NATO's head said he approved the American proposal for a major increase in armaments and troops to be based in Europe. This also came out this week, in the wake of Russian aggression. And what he's talking about in terms of Russian aggression, of course, is Ukraine, where the West, brackets United States, Britain, NATO, all those usual suspects, imposed a coup upon Ukraine, removed an elected leader. It might not have been a nice man, but he was an elected leader, and put in their puppet, Poroshenko. And they've used that ever since to, again, demonize Russia. Now, I mentioned that the idea is to create this war, and then after the war, the idea is to say, look, we can't go on like this. So what we're going to have is a world army, which one journalist said to me once, well, he called himself a journalist, what's the use of a world army? There'd be no one to fight. How about the population and keeping the population under control? The idea to create the world army is to impose the will of what they want after this war, which is a world government. The world army is being moved into place more and more and more under the name of NATO, among other things. And after this war that they're planning, we let them get away with it, they are going to announce some kind of peace deal, which will be to redraw global society in the image that they planned all along. Now, in my new book, Phantom Self, I quote an insider who described the world that was coming in 1969. And what he described, not only in terms of this, but in all the changes we're seeing in human society today, he was spot on in detail all those years ago, 1969. And I just mentioned that BBC program about a nuclear exchange involving Russia. And of course, if this Third World War got out of hand, it could very quickly become nuclear. And in 1969, this insider said this: if there were too many people in the right places who resisted this world dictatorship that he said was coming, there might be a need to use one or two, possibly more, nuclear weapons. This would possibly be needed to convince people that we mean business. By the time one or two of those went off, then everybody, even the most reluctant, he said, would yield. He said that, and this is the point of the aftermath, he said that the negotiated peace would be very convincing in a context that the whole thing was rehearsed, but nobody would know it. See, this is what's happening. You know, they call wars theatres of war. And in so many ways, that's what it is. The whole thing's a theatre. It's a game with actors playing their parts. Sometimes they know their parts, and sometimes they're ignorant, but they play their part because of that ignorance. And it's the whole thing is a perception deception, because from perception comes everything. Perception leads to action or no action, or what action, all depending on the perception. So this is a whole mind game to impose a perception of reality and world events upon the public that suits the outcome that these psychopaths want. So this insider went on. People hearing about the peace deal after the war and the nuclear exchange would be convinced that it was a genuine negotiation between hostile enemies who finally had come to the realization that peace was better than war. And I'm going to come to that in a second, because talk about the West, United States, Britain, Russia, China. But it depends what level you're talking about, because things look very different depending on what level you are perceiving this whole situation from. Like I say, I'll come to that in a second. But the demonization of Russia is becoming so blatant and so obviously coordinated. You've got shots of horrific shots of children in Aleppo in Syria now, being blamed for their death and injuries. Russia being blamed for that. And of course, if you drop bombs where people live, you're going to hit people that are civilians. The point is, the United States, Britain, NATO countries have been killing children and maiming children decade after decade after decade, and certainly in the Middle East in more recent times, year after year after year. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria. And where was all the outrage then from the Western media about the children killed and maimed by Western bombing? But suddenly, The demonization of Russia suits perfectly the presentation of Russia as the evil one killing children. Where were you excuses for journalists when the Western countries were and still are doing it? You have a situation where Saudi Arabia has now said that it would be prepared to put ground forces into Syria. The United Arab Emirates has said the same, and other Arab countries, and these are all, once again, the usual suspects, yawn, yawn, who do whatever the United States and the hidden hand tells them to do. You've had the BBC program, and you've got Russia now saying that it's aware that Turkey is making preparations for an invasion of Syrian territory. And it's all coming together. What I've been saying about this Third World War and the conflict between the West and Russia, China, is that it was planned to be triggered out of the Middle East. And now you have a situation where those very countries, because behind the Assad regime, supporting him with bombing and military support, is Russia, but also supporting the Assad regime is China, and also another target for this hidden hand, Iran. And you've got America in there, you've got Britain in there, you've got France in there, and on the sidelines there, you've got Israel in there too. And so in that small area of the world, Syria, you've got all the potential for what they want to break out. But like I said a few moments ago, there are different levels of looking at this, because knowledge of this global plan for world takeover and the transformation of global society into a Orwellian tyranny and then some, the knowledge of that and the information surrounding that is fiercely compartmentalized. What you're looking at is, well, you can symbolize it in many ways. You can symbolize it as a spider's web with a spider in the middle, and each strand going further out knows less and less and less of what the spider knows, and eventually you won't even know the spider exists if you go far enough out. You can do it as a pyramid with a few people at the top dictating to the pyramid, and further you go down the pyramid, the less and less that people in the pyramid know about what the game is that only those at the top really know. And so when you look at one level of this situation in Syria, you can see it as Russia coming in, Putin coming in, to protect an ally in Assad from blatant attempts to remove him and take over Syria by the West using proxy forces like they did in Libya and elsewhere. You can see it at that level. And on one level, that is happening. But if you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into it, you can look at it in another way. The hidden hand that's behind all this, and way beyond the Putins and the Obamas and the Camerons, it has now manipulated the situation it wanted, which was to get Russia and the West in a position where this conflict that they've been planning for so long can break out. And it depends, like I say, what level you're looking at. And here's the doll you would have seen behind me in other video casts. And appropriately, it's a Russian doll. And if you take that to be symbolic of the world that we see, The world you see on the news, the world you read about in the papers, the world you see in your everyday life. And it seems to be a certain way. In most of it, it seems to be random events, random occurrences, random situations. When actually, if you take that off, you find something else inside. And that level knows more than the level I've just shown you. But that level also has a level inside that. And the deeper you go into it, the more those levels will know about what's really going on. I'm getting the place up with these things now. But there are levels and levels and levels, and it keeps going, and it keeps going, until eventually you reach the point. I think that's the last one, is it? No, there's one more. Appropriate. And another one. And that's really appropriate, because if I put that back on there and hold these two together, that is extraordinarily symbolic, for anyone who reads my books and sees how it works, of how that controls that. And only at that level, deep in the hidden hand, deep in the shadows, only at that level do they know, unless you research your backside off and uncover it, do they know the real game, the real agenda, and what world events are really about and where they're meant to lead. Everyone else in these other levels knows less and less of what that knows. And in the end, you've got many, many people within the system, the so-called establishment, who are every day making a contribution to achieving the ends that wants symbolically, with no idea that exists, let alone what it is manipulating the world to be. And if people don't grasp how the world is controlled from the hidden by people who give evil a bad name, extreme psychopaths with no empathy and couldn't care less about the suffering of anybody. In fact, they enjoy it. If you don't realize that, then you're never going to understand the world. But fortunately, more and more people are beginning to see that the world is not like they thought it was. And the demonization of Russia now is all part of what that symbolically has been planning for decades and decades, and then some. More and more people, even in the short time he's been president, who were either sitting on the fence before or supported him, are beginning to see what this Trump phenomena is really all about and where it can potentially lead. And this is not least because as the days pass, what is happening is increasingly in letters 10 foot high. Of course, it will take neon lights flashing before many Trump supporters see through the facade and realize they've been had. And I do completely understand that, because there are few more powerful ways to get people to believe something than tell them what they want to hear. You tell them what they don't want to hear, of course, there's a resistance. They don't want that to be true. So they find reasons to reject it. But you tell them what they want to hear, and they're obviously vastly more likely to accept it, absorb it, and see it as real. the the progressives and that wing of American politics had this foisted upon them when the system did a job on them with Barack Obama. Of course, what did he do? He told them what they wanted to hear. And then when he got into office, he spent 8 years doing nothing like what he said he would do. In fact, continuing, not least in the Middle East, the policies of Bush. And now with Trump, they've done a similar job on the other wing of American politics by telling them what they want to hear. And Trump has said he will do this, he will do that. He's thrown in a few areas of conspiracy research. He said that, oh no, the whole global warming thing is a hoax. He says it's by China. Nonsense. It is a hoax, but not by China. And he's thrown in a few questions about 9/11 here and there. And he has therefore not only pulled in the if you like, the right in American politics, he's also pulled in much of the alternative media in America into this facade, into this vaudeville that is the Trump phenomena. Because it has to be psychological in the way people are pulled in, because this whole global conspiracy manipulation is a perception deception. You can't control people en masse, billions of people, physically, although this surveillance state is going closer and closer to it. You have to persuade them to believe what you want them to believe, to see the world and themselves as you want that to be seen. So that if you've got their perception, you'll get their actions. You'll get what they'll support, what they won't support. And politics is just an enormous perception deception. This is how it works. If you look into most countries, you have two parties, sometimes three, mostly two. America's a classic, that have any chance of forming a government. So people vote for Party A, and they get into government, and they don't do what the people want who voted for them. And so to get Party A out, people are left with one choice. They have to vote for Party B. So they get into power, and nothing changes. The same thing goes on, like Obama following Bush, basically. And so now you don't like Party B and what they've done, because they've pretty much done the same as Party A. So how do you get Party B out? You've only got one choice at the ballot box, and that's to vote for Party A again. And so you go A, B, A, B. It's choice. It's democracy. No, it's a farce. It's a rigged system. Now, the next question in this political illusion is, why do the parties do basically the same thing when they get into office? Well, it works like this. If you look at the Bush administration, that was controlled, I mean, even acknowledged in some parts of the mainstream media, by a group of people who were known as neocons or neoconservatives. And then if you look at the Democratic Party, they are controlled by a similar group of people, not least people including George Soros, Zbigniew Brzezinski, these sort of people, by a group that I call the Democons. And then, this is the key point, if you go back one step more into the shadows, outside of the public gaze, the neocons and the democons answer to the same force, the same masters. And thus, whoever's in power, be it Republican or Democrat, that force is always in power. And the idea therefore, is to use this perception deception to kid people that they actually have choice when the same force is always in power. And not least thanks to the alternative media over the last few decades, particularly more recently, people have started to see that actually, as some people say in America, it doesn't matter who you vote for because the government still gets in. Yes, the secret government, that force in the background. And so people have got more and more cynical and disinterested in politics, but you've got to keep them interested to give the political system any kind of credibility. So you sell them the first black president. Well, that worked out well for black people, didn't it? That brought people together. And you sell them a man who is about change and he's going to be different. Oh, yeah, vote for him. Well, that after 8 years went nowhere, which made many people even more cynical, not least because the person who was from the Democratic side, supposed to replace Obama, is one of the most corrupt politicians with her husband in American political history, Hillary Clinton. But then along comes Trump. And what does he do? He grabs the interest of people. Whether they like him or whether they don't like him, he's grabbed their interest. They're engaged in this farce called political choice and political parties. And so now we have Trump replacing Obama, but as I'll come to, what it looks like very clearly is it's just going to continue for reasons I'll explain. And for anyone who doesn't think that presidents are told what to do and that this hidden hand in the background is calling the shots, they should just look at the leaked WikiLeaks email of a man called Michael Froman, a former executive of Citibank, who sent an email to the Obama group before Obama was elected, suggesting the names for his administration in all these different positions, in the major positions of government and their subordinates. And what happened when Obama came to power is that almost in its entirety, those suggestions were appointed by Obama to government. This is the way it works, where this hidden hand is dictating to what are not the most powerful man in the world, but are just gophers for this force. Now, are we really going to believe that out of nowhere, just like Obama appeared to come out of nowhere, that Donald Trump has bucked the system? Hello. Of course, trying to sell Clinton as something different was basically an impossibility. You only look at Clinton and you see system, you see business as usual. And the idea is to sell to people that this new president is not business as usual, while they are business as usual. And so Trump has told people what they wanted to hear. He's told the alternative media in America what they wanted to hear. And so many people have bought the lie and bought the illusion. And the reason I say that the letters are now 10 foot high is, as I said about Trump all along, don't watch the words, watch the actions. So he has, in this short period, given the American economy to Goldman Sachs. Not only the economy, he's got Goldman Sachs people all the way through his administration, including this guy, Steve Bannon, who is right at his shoulder. And he's talking about scrapping vast amounts of regulation. And I agree. The world is far too fiercely regulated. But there is some regulation that is absolutely essential to stop the 1%, less than 1%, from running frickin' riot, as they did in the lead up to the financial crash in 2008. And these are the areas where Trump is talking about deregulating. Oh, we've got to deregulate to help small business. Yes, small business, medium-sized business is being drowned in regulation all over the world. But that's not what Trump's really talking about. That's the facade. That's telling people what they want to hear again. The real beneficiaries of this deregulation that he says he's going to introduce will be the Goldman Sachs, will be the JP Morgans, will be all these giants that led the world into financial catastrophe in 2008. Why? Because there had been decades and decades and decades of deregulation through Reagan Bush, through Father Bush, and through Clinton that had allowed that free-for-all to happen. And he's talking about tax cuts. Yeah. Tax cuts benefit mostly who? The mega rich. So the idea that Trump is for the working man and the working woman is a nonsense. But that's what the rhetoric says, while the beneficiaries are the very people in the swamp that he says he was going to drain. Then he hands civilian posts as head of the Pentagon, head of Homeland Security, and his national security advisor to military people. I mean, the very idea of putting a military person in charge of Homeland Security is outrageous. And then you realize that there is another common theme, that these military people like Mad Dog Mattis in the Pentagon, Defense Secretary, and the National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, are fiercely opposing and demonizing Iran. This is what Trump has been doing. Then you look at Israel, which in so many ways owns Trump. And they have started this rhetoric and demonization of Iran. Netanyahu was doing it in London when he met the British Prime Minister this week. And of course, Saudi Arabia, who is a truly fundamental opponent and hater of Iran, is in there as well. And I posted this picture on the website and social media on December the 15th last year, because it was already obvious to me where this whole thing was going. When you put the dots, you put the pieces together. And so since Trump came into office, the mantra has been Iran, 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 Iran. And there's a reason for that. Let's go back to the time just before Boy George Bush came to power. This neocon group that came to power a few months later with Bush were behind an organization called the Project for the New American Century. And they produced a document in September 2000 listing a series of countries that they wanted the United States to regime change in what they called multiple theater wars. And these countries included Iraq, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, and the biggest prize of all, Iran. They also called for regime change in China. That'll be fun. And when they came to power with Bush, this policy was instigated. But of course, how do you justify regime changing in those countries and starting a process of catastrophic intervention in the Middle East? Well, along came 1 year to the month after that document was published, and 9 months after those people who wrote it came to power with Bush, along came 9/11, in which they were able to find the excuse to start ticking off those regime change countries. And ironically, the one they've not yet, at least, targeted, and indeed continue to arm with state-of-the-art weaponry to kill people like Yemenis, Saudi Arabia, was, according to the official story of 9/11, nonsensical as it actually was, they were the country from which the overwhelming majority of the alleged hijackers came from. And yet, when Trump issued his travel ban list, Saudi Arabia was not on it, nor was Qatar, and these other countries that have funded ISIS and can't stand Iran. And if you look at Trump's travel ban countries, all you have to do is replace Lebanon on the Project for the New American Century list of countries for regime change. You have to replace that with Yemen. And Trump's travel ban list is an exact mirror of the countries being targeted by the Project for the New American Century in September 2000. And then you look what has happened since that document was published. After Afghanistan, justified by we must get bin Laden because the Taliban's there and he's there, there was the invasion of Iraq, completely made up with weapons of mass destruction. Why? It's on the list. They don't have a reason to invade Iraq, so they made one up. Simple as that. And then the two politicians fronting that up, Boy George Bush and Tony Blair, they were replaced at the time of the invasion of Libya by Obama and David Cameron, the British Prime Minister. Now we've got different politicians from different parties to the other two, but it's the same list. Now we're on to Libya on the Project of the New American Century list. And then where did they go next? Into Syria. Says the former French foreign minister Roland Dumas said on French television that he was in London talking to British government officials before the trouble started in Syria with the so-called Arab Spring People's Revolution. And these British officials told him, before anything had happened, that they were going to start something in Syria with rebels against Assad. And this is what has happened in relation to America, or this is what's behind it, as they have picked off these countries on this project for the New American Century list. Here is a document headed U.S. Special Forces Unconventional Warfare Strategy, November 30th, 2010. And this isn't the American military process, technique for regime changing these countries on that list. This is what it said. Remember, November 2010. The US military's unconventional warfare strategy requires that target state population perceptions are first groomed into accepting an armed insurrection using, quote, propaganda and political and psychological efforts to discredit the government. That's what happened with all these countries that they have been involved in with this Arab Spring. This, they say, will create local and national agitation, helping organize, quote, boycott strikes and other efforts to suggest public discontent before beginning the infiltration of foreign organizers and advisors and foreign propaganda, material, money, weapons, and equipment. Exactly what happened in Libya, exactly what happened in Syria. And it goes on, if retaliation by the target government, in other words, if the government defends itself from your so-called freedom fighter people's revolution, which you've orchestrated and funded and armed, if there's retaliation from the government to that, the resistance can exploit the negative consequences to garner more sympathy and support from the population by emphasizing the sacrifices and hardship the resistance is enduring on behalf of, quote, the people. This is why nothing was said when these Western armed, funded and trained rebels and mercenaries started attacking the regime of Gaddafi. It was only when Gaddafi responded, was only when Assad responded, that suddenly he's killing his own people, and the whole psychological game was played out exactly as they said. When? November 2010. 1 month later, after this was published, and of course it would have been in the background, organized long before, we had the start of the Arab Spring with the events in Tunisia. And George Soros and his networks are, of course, behind that, if anyone wants to do a modicum of research. So we have these countries on the Project for the New American Century list being picked off quite demonstrably across different administrations, because that force I talked about earlier in the background is in control of whoever's in power. So that agenda plays out through whoever's in power, or officially so. But then you might say, well, there's a problem with this, because Obama did this nuclear deal with Iran, the big prize of these people. And so everything was honky-dory there. And people said to me at the time, well, where's this Iran thing you were talking about? Because, Obama's done this deal and everything seems fine with Iran. Well, let me go back to another document. It's from 2009, and it was published by a think tank connected to all these networks I'm talking about, and funded by their sources, called the Brookings Institution. And this was a document published like I say, 2009. And it was called Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Towards Iran. And it said that Iran should be given a, quote, superb offer only to be intentionally revoked in a manner that portrayed Iran as ungrateful. Anyone notice a connection with current events? This is what the document said. Any military operation against Iran will likely be very unpopular around the world and require the proper international context, both to ensure the logistical support the operation would require and to minimize the blowback from it. The best way to minimize international opprobrium, criticism, censure, and maximize support, however grudging or covert, is to strike only when there is a widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer, one so good that only a regime determined to acquire nuclear weapons and acquire them for the wrong reasons would turn it down. Under those circumstances, the United States or Israel, it says, could portray its operations as taken in sorrow, not anger. And at least some in the international community would conclude that the Iranians brought it on themselves by refusing a very good deal. Did I mention it was a perception, deception, the whole thing? Exactly what it is, exactly what this is. So, this superb offer then was produced and negotiated by Obama and other countries, including the European Union, with Iran. And everything seemed fine. But when Trump came to power, it was all very different. He said the deal was basically a disaster and bad for America. And when there was a testing by Iran of a ballistic missile recently, which was not in contravention of the deal, they had their excuse. And what did Trump say? Trump said, and so did this Michael Flynn, national security advisor and Iran hater extraordinaire, along with his mate, Mad Dog. They said that Iran had been put on notice, and that Trump said that Iran should have been thankful, here's the wording again, should have been thankful for the nuclear deal. And this is one of his tweets. Yes, the American president communicates with the world on Twitter. This is what Trump said. Iran is playing with fire. They don't appreciate how kind President Obama was to them, not me. Which kind of fits this whole Brookings Institution scenario to put the blame for any conflict upon Iran. And this is how it works in the background, manipulating public perception to accept what the agenda wants. This is why all the propaganda against Gaddafi at the time, all the propaganda against Assad, that's what it's all about. All the propaganda against Saddam Hussein about weapons of mass destruction that could strike British targets in 45 minutes to justify an invasion. It's all a perception deception. And so let's come back to Trump. You have a situation where this man is perceived to be different and outside the system. I mean, don't start me laughing, I'll never stop. And yet what we're seeing is a continuation of the same theme and the same countries being targeted that has passed through Boy Bush, Obama, and to Trump. And, you know, people in the alternative media who have campaigned against certain things and exposed certain things over the years, they really do need to rub their eyes and refocus on what they're now supporting. We have a situation where Goldman Sachs has been given the economic control of the United States. We've had these military people given these what should be civilian posts. We've got Trump talking about torture is justified, um, demonizing Iran on the way to seeking conflict with them, and you know, causing chaos. And as I said in last week's video cast, chaos is the currency of these people. They want chaos so that they can offer the order out of the chaos, which is to transform society in the way they want it to change. It's what might be called creative destruction. You destroy the status quo through chaos, whatever that status quo is. You then change the status quo. You then creatively destroy that status quo, and so it goes on. And at each new status quo, the world has changed. There's no two greater examples than the world wars in the 20th century. The First World War vastly changed and creatively destroyed the status quo that had been before. And then the Second World War came along and destroyed the status quo that had followed the First World War. And we're just seeing the continuation of this. And you see, this is the danger. I'm not even saying that Trump is fully aware of what's going on. He probably isn't. But the people around him are. The people in the shadows that control the people around him are. And what they have now in the White House is an extreme narcissist with an ego so big and so fragile that he can't let criticism on Twitter go, or criticism by some celebrity go, without having to react to it. This is not what mature, secure people do. And so because of his lack of awareness of the whole political system, he'll have some from his life in business, but I mean really deeply. And because of his narcissistic, egotistical, reactive behavior, the big I am, he is a manipulator's party trick. I mean, if you gave a manipulator a blank sheet of paper and said, describe your ideal person to manipulate, they would draw a picture of Donald Trump. And we need to, those that support Trump need to see this. And those that don't support Trump also need to get informed about how the world really works, instead of just reacting to it in this two-party, left-right manner. We need to take a step back and see the left-right nonsense as just an irrelevance to anything that's going to change anything. Because that left-right us and them structure, mentality, is what's holding people in this illusion where nothing changes. And if you look at it, it's like an electrical system where both sides need each other. You know, you've got one polarity, the progressives, and then you've got the other polarity, which are basically now the Trump supporters. And they create, by their resistance, they talk about resistance, which is an electrical circuit is made between the two, and the electrical circuit goes on doing this and changes nothing, but creates the very upheaval that the hidden hand wants to justify more and more of the police state and the surveillance state. And that's another thing. when you look at Sessions, Bush's, not Bush's, Trump's, it could be Bush's involved there. When you look at him as Attorney General and his attitudes to human rights and freedoms, what we're also going to see through this Bush, these are Freudian slips, but they're very apt, because I could have said Trump there, I could have said Bush, and I could have said Obama. Tragically, that's how it works. And we're going to see through this Trump administration also, justified by law and order, more and more advances of this surveillance state and this police state. Not least now, they have a military man running Homeland Security. So on the day that Bush was, I've said it again, Bush, Obama, Trump, on the day that Trump was elected, I said that it was a primal scream for help by vast numbers of Americans who had been ignored decade after decade. But that they were voting for an illusion that Trump was not what he claimed to be. We're now starting to see that already. But I said I hoped that the experience of seeing the Trump illusion unfold would lead people to the next stage, which is the realization that this rigged political system of left, right, Democrat, Republican, conservative, Labour, whatever country, whatever parties, this rigged system is never going to change anything for the better. And thus we have the realization that there are billions of us and a very few who are in full awareness manipulating those billions towards the end that my books expose in detail. And if we stop cooperating by not following the diktats of these people when they impose and impinge upon our freedoms and basic justice and fairness, then we take their power away. We have the power, but we give it away in acquiescence to that which we think has the power. The only power they have is the power that we give them day after day after day. We need to take it back and start saying we're not having it. Not by voting for Trump or voting for Clinton. It's going to change nothing. But by refusing to cooperate with what the system seeks to impose upon us. Do that and we'll get somewhere. If you want to see fake news, then just read the mainstream media decade after decade after decade. That is not to say there is not so-called, not really, but claimed to be, alternative sources that put out fake news. They do. And I'm going to be giving you in my opinion, a shocking example and classic example of that in a minute. But that's not what this fake news hoax, this fake news tirade is all about. It is to justify the suppression of information from the genuine alternative media, and like I say, not all of it is, so that we have one source. We go back to one source of information from which people get their opinions and views and perceptions, and that's the mainstream media. The mainstream corporate media that's connected to all the other areas of the system, politics, big pharma, big biotech, etc., which constitute what I call the mainstream everything. And perception is the key. We are being subjected to, and have been through almost all known human history, certainly modern history, to a perception deception. It's the name of one of my books. And when you are seeking to program the perceptions of your target population, then you need to control the information that they receive. Because everything comes from perception. What we think, what we do, what we support, what we won't support, what we oppose, all comes from our perceptions of life, the world, and particular events, particular people. And when you are trying to program the perceptions of your target human race, then of course, to do that most effectively, you need to make sure they only have one basic source of information, one basic way of looking at the world, of looking at events like Syria. Because from information comes perception. The last thing you want is for people to present other ways of looking at the same things from different angles, with different information, making it look different to what the mainstream is portraying. This is true of reporting of world events and their significance and their context. It is true of things like vaccines, GMO. You need to get rid of that source of information which is challenging your narrative. Now, what's happened, and I was there when it all began. There weren't many of us around at the time, but a movement began, made up of individuals, not organized, to put out information and to do research that challenged the mainstream narrative. And this has gathered and gathered and gathered in effectiveness, to the point now where we are having vast numbers of people getting their information from non-mainstream sources, and the corporate media losing audiences and viewers on a catastrophic scale, catastrophic for the mainstream media, that is. And there is also, not least as a result of alternative sources of information, a growing rejection of the established order, the established tyranny, the elected dictatorships. And so, in a massive and in many ways panic-stricken response, the war on alternative sources of information has now gone into top gear. Everywhere you look, fake news, fake news. And of course, what's it's being hung on is that it was fake news that got Donald Trump elected. What got him elected was the perception, wrong, I would suggest, but the perception that he was outside of the system, that he was outside the political class and establishment. That's what got him elected. And to hear Hillary Clinton this week saying that fake news is a danger to people. This is the queen of fake news, exposed in WikiLeaks emails released as the Clinton campaign was in cohorts with mainstream media corporate outlets to manipulate information to the benefit of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton lost that election because she has a history of pure evil and breathtaking mendacity and corruption. And people rejected it in very large numbers. Nothing to do with fake news. What in the end did for her was the truth coming out, ironically. So we have this focus now on what is called fake news, and this is what happens. I'm not saying for a minute there isn't fake news in what people call the alternative, but like I say, if it's fake news, it's not alternative. It's just another version of the mainstream techniques of a manipulation. But the idea is to use that and use this all-encompassing term of fake news to target the genuine alternative media, which does professional research and professionally make sure in every way it can that its facts are right before it goes public with them. That's nothing like, whew, are you kidding? That's nothing like the totality of the alternative media. But that's the part of it that they're targeting, because that's the one that's dangerous to them. And of course, mainstream media loves all this. Of course it's going to jump on this coordinated, blatantly so, attack on the alternative media under this fake news banner. Because it wants to protect itself. It wants to protect itself from the rejection of people. And thus it supports it. And what you get is, as long as you are going along and you're not a danger to this global agenda that I've been exposing all these years, then you're basically left alone. When there was an alternative media that wasn't actually that influential because it was in its early days, just left alone, really, no problem. Once it becomes a problem, then they turn on it, which is what's happening now. In the same way, as long as you are in vast, overwhelming numbers accepting vaccinations and your children being vaccinated, well, okay. Oh, no, it's not compulsory. No, it's a choice. As long as everyone does it, that's fine. Now, people in ever greater numbers are rejecting that by doing research into actually what the consequences are. Now we're seeing coming in these laws to make vaccination compulsory in parts of the world, and it's planned to be universal in the end. And you know, I've got a little bit of, well, what do you call it? Information, advice? I don't know. Maybe you could call it seeing things for what they are in terms of the mainstream media. So, mainstream, this is why your audiences are collapsing and your credibility has never been lower. People in ever greater numbers are sick and tired of your lies, your bias, your systematic manipulation of so-called news and information, and the fact that they are realizing ever more clearly that you are just an arm of the very establishment you should, if you were real journalists, be holding to account. That's why what's happening to you is happening, not because of any fake news, but because of your fake news, decade after decade after decade. I mean, this is a report this week in a mainstream newspaper about the fact that the terrorists, because that's what they are, United States, British, backed, armed, trained, supported terrorists in Aleppo in Syria. This is the report on how they have been virtually now removed from Aleppo after the extraordinarily grotesque treatment of people, civilians, children, under their control in parts of that city. Instead of celebrating the fact that these people have been freed now in great numbers from that tyranny, from that horror, this is what you get. With Syrian city falling to Assad and Putin, the executions of women and children begin a meltdown of humanity. Evidence? Bugger all! There's no one on the ground there in terms of correspondence. They're getting their information from, if you call it that, from sources that are absolutely not to be trusted. I mean, it quotes here the White Helmets. The White Helmets, who are an organization supposedly created to help people in a humanitarian way, who are funded by all the players who have funded, armed and trained these terrorists, including ISIS, United States, Britain, EU, etc. Oh yeah, that's an unbiased source. And they also quote over and over again in terms of Syria, the mainstream media, an organization called the Syria Observatory for Human Rights. Oh, that sounds grand. Oh, bet they've got a big building. They must be in Syria. They must. You're going to quote them at what's happening in Syria in such detail with unquestioned, questioning their accuracy. Do you know what the Syria Observatory for Human Rights is? One man. But at least he lives in Syria. No, he doesn't. He lives in Coventry, in England. Oh, the Syria Observatory for Human Rights said this is terrible what Assad's doing. The man in Coventry hates Assad. And the mainstream media talk about fake news. Do they have mirrors in these buildings? I guess they must not. Within 24 hours, an estimated 10,000 people had fled the horror, but last night there were at least 50,000 still trapped. We're seeing in other mainstream sources things like 100,000 people are still under siege from Assad and the Russians. Evidence? Zilch. And, you know, there are so many ironies in this. I'll give you another one. When the mainstream media has played its part, which is the idea of destroying the alternative, then do you think this hidden hand that wants rid of the alternative media, for reasons I've discussed, is going to allow any part of the mainstream media to tell the truth about anything? Have you seen how the mainstream media even has been targeted more and more around the world in terms of suppression of what it can say? Talk about turkeys campaigning for Christmas So it's the Russians, it's the Russians, it's the Russians all the way through the mainstream media. It's the Russians that manipulated the American election. Evidence? Oh, the CIA said. Yes, the CIA, who has a history of mendacity that is truly staggering. If the CIA ever told the truth, it would genetically implode from the shock. It's the Russians, I burnt me toast, it's the Russians, oh yeah, it's the Russians, he burnt his toast. It's pathetic. And what we're seeing is in all these different areas, not just in things like Syria, we're seeing the imposition of rules, regulations and laws that are stopping the free flow of information. So, again, we have had now the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, saying that a new definition of anti-Semitism is going to be introduced. Now, this is absolutely nothing to do with protecting Jewish people from attacks and racism. Nothing. It's about protecting the merciless regime in Tel Aviv from legitimate exposure and criticism. That's what it's about. And again, fake news. Theresa May said that one of the reasons this is happening is because attacks on Jewish people in Britain are reportedly on the rise. Well, where do these figures come from? Must be solid, surely. They must be independent. Otherwise, we won't believe them and change things as a result of them. Well, these figures come from an organisation originally set up by the British Board of Jewish Deputies, the big Jewish organisation in Britain, which is now, what was set up is now a charity, where the guy running it gets a really fat salary every year. And it is founded on donations, massive donations, from Jewish people who are frightened of racism and attacks. So, will they go on funding that unless they believe that they are in danger from these attacks and they're rising? The question answers itself. And yet we're taking reports from these organizations, or this organization in this case, on attacks, anti-Semitic attacks in Britain. Everywhere you look, there are vested interests providing so-called information on which the world changes. And free flow of information is suppressed. And what we're looking at now is a takeover of information, a gathering global ministry of truth, as Orwell called it in 1984. A ministry of truth in that book, whose real role was propaganda and revising history to suit the perception deception of the day. And one of the major areas this is happening is in involving the internet giants of search engines, Google, the monster that is Google, and social media like Facebook, Twitter. See, this has been the game. You start social media and search engines and all this stuff, and you then allow the free flow of information. And people think, oh, this is great. You understand that. They think, oh, this is great. You know, you can say what you like. You can have an opinion and all that stuff. Yeah. But then, as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, this has been the plan all along, there comes a point where they start to dominate the flows of information and the means of those flows that people get. And once you've reached that point where you think you're strong enough and big enough and unassailable enough, then you start censoring that information. And that's what we're seeing now. More and more and more, getting alternative information circulating on these social medias is getting more and more difficult. There was some figures I was given this week about my own work. For instance, on Facebook, there are about 700,000 what you might call followers that want information from my Facebook page. Of those 700,000, only between 5 and 10% actually receive alerts and receive the posts when they're posted every day. 5 to 10%. And then there's Twitter. In the last year, my YouTube channel has received 17.7 million views of videos. That's around, I'm told, 48,000 views a day. Of that 48,000, an average of 104 come from Twitter, even though those links are posted on Twitter every time there's a new video. And clearly, there are algorithms and there are blocking codes being used to stop the free flow of information that the system doesn't want. We're also seeing organizations like YouTube, owned by Google, demonetizing videos from the alternative media based on the information they're putting out. And a lot of people in the alternative media actually survive, often with a meager income from money they get from monetization of YouTube videos. And the system knows that. That's why that's been specifically targeted. Like I say, there's a war on alternative information. And just to show you that what is happening to me in terms of suppression of this information on social media is not just happening to me. It's happening to people right across the genuine alternative media. This is a story this week. What they call this stuff is ghost banning, apparently. This is a headline. Ghost banning on social media, the start of systematic censorship. There is mounting evidence, it says, that alternative news providers are the targets of censorship on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and elsewhere. We are told it's called ghost banning, meaning you are present, though invisible, in plain sight, and the user is completely unaware. The goal is frighteningly obvious. Deny an offending website traffic to the point that it disappears from public view. This, it says, is a new business model of the old art of controlling what is considered acceptable speech by the powers that be. As a result, legacy news outlets that comprise of the world of corporate mainstream media are propped, crowding out alternative views and dissent. Freedom of speech faces an existential threat, or existential threat. Now, this is a quote from Craig Murray. Craig Murray is a former UK ambassador who writes and speaks out about the way the system is so corrupt. And this is what he says. I had never heard of ghost banning until I was ghost banned by Twitter. That, of course, is the idea. They censor you without realizing, or you realizing you are censored. People no longer get notifications when I post, and the tweet only turns up in the Twitter line of followers who happen to be logged in at the time my tweet goes out. Exactly the sort of thing that's happening to me. Those logging in later will no longer see tweets I issued while they were away. Most of my tweets no longer show up on Twitter searches, and further restrictions are applied when people retweet my tweets. Since ghost banning, he says, traffic to this website from Twitter has fallen 90%. This is what is going on. And it's because the system, which these internet giants are expressions of, are terrified of alternative information, which trashes and dismantles their deception. But let me make this point, and it's equally important. Does fake news exist outside of the mainstream media? Too right it does. And those peddlers of it are helping to destroy the genuine alternative media by giving that which wants to destroy it ammunition. They hold up this fake news crap and say this is the alternative media. I was sent a classic example of it this week from a website called Your Newswire. Operates out of California, and it's run by someone who years ago was a webmaster of davidicke.com. The irony is not lost. And this article, he says in quotes, is written by someone, we are told, called Baxter Dimitri. Baxter Dimitri does not exist. And the picture put alongside Baxter Dimitri is actually the picture of a British sound recordist who I met a number of times years ago. This is what the headline says. Lady Gaga, Prince Charles is not human, in quote. So this is a classic clickbait headline designed to make you click on it and add to the advertising revenue of the site. Lady Gaga, the buzz name there. Oh, Lady Gaga, Prince Charles, another one. Put them together. Prince Charles is not human. Now, people will realize that I've been talking about stuff like that for a long time, not least in books like Children of the Matrix, about a human reptilian hybrid bloodline that actually is manipulating human affairs. But I do it in books where I'm quoting people who've experienced this. I'm quoting people who have knowledge of this by name. So people can then make their own minds up based on that. But this is what this story has done, basically taking that theme and then making it up. Lady Gaga has told senior staff and associates that Prince Charles is not human, but is a hybrid that shapeshifts between human and reptilian form, straight out of my work. Apparently, Lady Gaga met Prince Charles at the Royal Variety Performance in London on December the 7th and was criticised in some quarters of the tabloid press for failing to observe royal etiquette, all that stuff. It's now been revealed by whom? Doesn't say. Why? They don't exist. It's now been revealed that Lady Gaga avoided Prince Charles after he shapeshifted during a brief introduction. Quote, Prince Charles was 8 foot tall with yellow eyes that flicker and scaly skin the colour of an iguana. Source of the quote by Lady Gaga? Is it anywhere else? No. The Prince of Wales shapeshifted between this state and human form 2 or 3 times, quote, after introducing himself to her. She claims, Lady Gaga claims, here you go, that she saw him shapeshift in the audience while he performed her song, or she performed her song, maybe he did too, A Million Reasons. Quote, his face in the crowd flashed between human and reptile. I could see his reptile teeth glistening in the light from the other side of the room. Evidence for this? Support for this quote? Zilch. And so she is supposed to have said all this, but of course never did. And then this writer, Baxter Dimitri, who doesn't actually exist, says Lady Gaga's first-hand experiences of the reptilian Illuminati chime with my own research and second-hand accounts. He says, I have dedicated, and what he's doing there is basically taking, well, he's not because he doesn't exist. He's taking basically the theme of my own life and then claiming for himself. I've dedicated the last 5 years to researching the elusive tyrannical powers that rule our world. Traveling to over 80 countries, what, in 5 years? Blimey. He gets around. And it never ceases to amaze me how many people from very different walks of life have told me stories about seeing people briefly turn into reptilians before their very eyes. I've been told this, says the non-existent Baxter Dimitri. I've been told this by American cable news anchors, Ethiopian goat herds, speaking goats, that's good, and Australian Aboriginals, just to name a few. And in Peru, a respected psychic, unnamed, no background, no circumstances. In Peru, Peru, which is very much connected to my life, as some people will know. In Peru, a respected psychic told me she sees powerful politicians like Obama, Angela Merkel, and Justin Trudeau turn into reptiles whenever she watches an international news channel. Support for that? Zilch. And this claims to be the alternative media. And the genuine alternative needs to start addressing this and calling this stuff out and those behind it, because it is giving the very fuel to those mainstream everything powers that are seeking to discredit and destroy the genuine alternative media. And there needs to be a second category: the genuine alternative media and the fake news, clickbait crap. They need to be very clearly defined as not being the same. But there is some good in all this, in a way. The fact that there is this concerted, coordinated demonization of the alternative media under the genuine one, under the heading of fake news, means that we are having an effect. These social media giants don't suppress information from people like me because it's a bit of fun. If it wasn't having an effect, they wouldn't even bother. And so it is confirmation that the world is changing. The mainstream everything is now being challenged in its perception deception. And this is manifesting as more and more people seeing the truth behind the curtain. And so this is not going to go away. It's going to increase these attempts to not just demonize the alternative media, but legislate against it. And we need to stay strong, and we need to keep putting this out, because the alternative to an alternative in terms of freedom is unthinkable, and we must not allow it to happen. They sit there, stand there, cheering in all the right places. Actually, if they did any research, all the wrong places. And they wave their placards. Here's one for Obama, here's one for Clinton, here's one for Trump, here's one for Trump for women, here's one for Clinton for women. And then you have the directors of the television coverage, which is supposed to be impartial, cutting up all these images just at the right point in the speech. And you see people, election after election, lied to by professional liars and professional psychopaths, telling them what they want to hear, knowing full well that whether Republican or Democrat, once the cheering dies down and someone's elected to office, whichever party it is, they will go on doing what their corporate and hidden hand masters tell them to do and fund them to do. And we have had some little chinks of light, a sign that some people are starting to get just some of it in the supporters of Bernie Sanders and the way that they have rejected Hillary Clinton. And I'll come to that later. It's not anything as far as we need to go in understanding how it all works, but it's a start. And so we have, and I've been researching the Clintons since the mid-1990s. We have the personification of political mendacity and political corruption. We have someone whose political career, not least as Secretary of State under Obama, has been catastrophic for so many people, not least people with brown faces in the Middle East. We have the Clintons up to their neck in financial corruption. We have them with a stream of unexplained deaths of people over decades who, in some way or other, threatened their, it's not the right word, but I'll use it, reputation. And right up to this speech today, we have had email leaks showing that the establishment of the Democratic Party, not least led by the chairwoman now resigned because of it, Wasserman Schultz, systematically conspiring to undermine Bernie Sanders' campaign so that the chosen one, Clinton, can get in. And Clinton, as usual, with all these scandals decade after decade, says, I didn't know it was going on. But what does she then do? She appoints Wasserman Schultz as honorary head of her presidential election campaign. So right up to this speech, still more confirmation of Clinton's corruption, which is, in her case and her husband's case, genetic. And still, I have just watched thousands of people who will ludicrously persuade themselves they have a mind of their own, who have cheered someone with that record and want her to be president of the United States. We have seen Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Michelle Obama, Meryl Streep, clueless celebrities for Hillary.com, by the way, Chelsea Clinton, all of them standing up and eulogizing. Oh, Bill Clinton, of course. Eulogizing over this godlike, goddess-like figure of sobriety, truth, and honesty. When they all know what I know about, well, Meryl Streep apart, clueless celebrities for Hillary.com. They all know what I know about her background and the true nature of who she is. Hillary cares for children. Well, they should read books like Transformation of America by a former mind-controlled slave of the American military stroke government stroke intelligence community. And see, going way back decades, what Hillary Clinton was up to then, what Bill Clinton was up to then, how close, fundamentally close, they are to the Bush family as supposed to be political opponents. They should read whistleblowers' books. They should read, if they want to know, my book from the mid-1990s, And the Truth Shall Set You Free, and The Biggest Secret that followed, and see how the Clintons and the Bushes were running drugs through the Mena airstrip in Arkansas during the Iran-Contra scandal, and when Bill Clinton was governor for Arkansas. They should see what a farce it all is. Are you listening, Meryl? What do you know about Hillary Clinton? Well, she's a woman and I'm a woman. What more do you need to know? Because the fact that she's a woman is irrelevant. It's not whether you're a man or a woman or black or white. It's the content of your character, as Martin Luther King said. And so this attempt to elect Hillary Clinton as president is not about electing the first woman president. It's about electing the first female asset of the hidden hand and the corporate networks that up to this point have been controlling the men in the White House. The outcome for women, the outcome for children, the outcome for America and the world is not going to change because Hillary Clinton's a woman. It would change if Hillary Clinton was a woman not connected to the hidden hand. But she is, and so nothing will change. She will, if we let her do it, and she becomes president, she will take the world into World War III with the West pitched against Russia, China. Because that's the plan. And she will do anything to advance the plan because she is completely and utterly controlled by those that direct the plan. She said in her speech just now how she'll take on the banks and take on the corporations. What? You mean the ones funding her to a limitless amount so that she will become president to represent their interests? Hillary, Hillary. It's extraordinary. And Bill Clinton and Chelsea Clinton talking about their wonderful family life and their Bill Clinton and their life together. Anyone even fractionally close to the Clintons who's done a modicum research into the Clintons knows that it's a marriage of convenience for both of them. They go off, do their own thing. But, oh no, it's the Clintons. It's a marriage of convenience. That's all it is. I mean, Bill will be rubbing his hands now about all the money they can make selling privilege to the highest bidder if they get in that White House. Just like they did before, when he was in. What a joke it all is. And then we come to Trump. I watched Trump's speech at the Republican convention. And I watched the crowd with the banners and the sticks, and I watched how they reacted to him, exactly the same as people just reacted to Hillary Clinton. When I was watching the Trump speech last week, I looked at the scene, and it could have been Barack Obama when he was accepting the nomination of the Democrats. They call them different names, Republican Democrats, but the mentality of the crowd is just the same. They are looking for a Messiah to save them. And last time with Obama, it was the first black president. Oh, the Messiah. Well, that worked out well for black people, didn't it? What's he done for them? Nothing. And now we're talking about the first woman president with Clinton. What will she do for women? The same. Because they're both serving not women, not black people, but their hidden hand. And so I was looking at Trump, and he was going to make America great again. He was going to take on corporate interests. Why? Because that's what people want to hear, just like with Clinton. Both of them and their running mates, staunch supporters of Israel. That's a gimme. You don't get in if you don't do that, because the hidden hand won't allow it. And he was going to get rid of ISIS very quickly. Sorry about the sun, by the way, not like I do. How is he going to do that? He never said. And he's either not going to do it, or in his barely one-dimensional mind, he's going to carpet bomb the whole of the Middle East, shooting in all directions. He was going to stop trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which are really bad for people, but great for corporations. And then he takes on a running mate, Mike Pence, who is for all of it, who stands for everything that Trump says he doesn't stand for. Same with this Tim Kaine, this running mate of Clinton. His record: support banking regulation, support the trade agreements. All the things she's saying, oh no, we'll take that on. And the whole thing is so unbelievably simple, and it works every time. You tell people what they want to hear to get elected, and then you do what you were always going to do, because that's what the hidden hand and your corporate masters are insisting that you do in return for their support. But like I say, there were some good signs in the way that Bernie Sanders supporters made their feelings very clear, in the way that their campaign was systematically undermined by the very Democratic Party establishment that's supposed to have been there to ensure a fair election. They don't get the big picture clearly, or they wouldn't have been at the Democratic convention at all, because they'd realised that politics is never going to change anything, because it's not meant to. It's not what it's there for. But at least they're starting to see the scale of corruption on one level behind politics and within the political parties, to ensure that the chosen ones of the hidden hand are the ones that run for president, and not some maverick who could cause a problem. And they either accept that and carry on as before in the Democratic Party, or they realize that the politics is irrelevant and start trying to make a difference in another way, like organizing people outside of politics to challenge their political impositions. There are, after all, a handful of people running politics compared with more than 300 million people in America, more than 7 billion people in the world. They can only have the power to do what they do because we give it to them. And I must say, I have been desperately disappointed with Bernie Sanders. He was a man, what is he, 74? What's to gain anymore, Bernie, by falling in line with the establishment? What's to gain? He had confirmation through these emails, he must have known before anyway, that there was a concerted campaign and conspiracy to stop him getting the nomination, no matter what support he had, because Hillary was the chosen one. And then it has all this confirmation with the emails, like I say. And even then, he falls into line, plays the game, says support Hillary Clinton, announces her nomination, etc., in the hall. You know, the point has come, if anything's going to change, where people have to start doing what is right and stop doing what they think is the done thing. Bernie Sanders had the opportunity to make a fantastic difference. He could have said, having looked at the choices we've got, there is no choice in my opinion. So therefore I cannot nominate Hillary Clinton. And I cannot support Donald Trump. So I'm stepping back and letting people decide for themselves. That would have made a massive, massive statement in terms of showing the system for what it is, corrupt, and what political choice is for what it is, an illusion. But instead, he plays the game and leaves it to his supporters to try to make those points. So I hope the penny's starting to drop with more and more people. I kind of know it is going around Australia. I feel that happening here and in other places. The understanding that politics is going to change anything, is not going to change anything. We need to come together as people outside the political system and start refusing to cooperate with it. Because unless we do, nothing's going to change. You know why? Nothing can. The demonization of Russia in multiple ways is designed to prepare the global public to accept a conflict with that country, to protect the West. And after, like I say, all these years since I first started saying this was the global plan, we had this week the Pentagon announced